This is part of the summer sermon series on hot button social issues, but I can tell you that I planned for this topic on this day, knowing that the Supreme Court issues its most controversial decisions about this time of year. And so the topic of the sermon is reproductive rights, and as we know, the Supreme Court recently ruled to overturn Roe versus Wade. Most of the sermon was at least drafted 3 weeks ago because I planned for this. But what I didn't quite anticipate, and I should have, was the raw emotion that loved ones who are women, friends, family, had to this decision. And I want to acknowledge that here at the beginning of the sermon, the grief, the anger, the righteous rage of having rights taken away that have been yours for so long. And so I wanted to start with just a moment of silence to feel that and to be with that before getting into the meat of the sermon. So let's take a moment of silence. Holy God, may the words of my mouth and the meditations of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our rock and our Redeemer. Pastor David Barnhart is a Methodist pastor, and I honestly couldn't find much about him except that he said what I'm about to read to you. He writes this: "The unborn," in quotation marks, the unborn, are a convenient group of people to advocate for. They never make demands of you. They are morally uncomplicated, unlike the incarcerated, addicted, or chronically poor. They don't resent your condensation or complain that you are not politically correct. Unlike widows, they don't ask you to question patriarchy. Unlike orphans, they don't need money, education, or childcare. Unlike aliens, they don't bring all that racial, cultural, and religious baggage that you dislike. They allow you to feel good about yourself without any work at creating or maintaining relationships. And when they are born, you can forget about them because they cease to be unborn. It's almost as if by being born, they have died to you. You can love the unborn and advocate for them without substantially challenging your own wealth, power, or privilege, without reimagining social structures, apologizing, or making reparations to anyone. They are, in short, the perfect people to love if you want to claim you love Jesus, but actually dislike people who breathe. The movement to make abortion illegal and decide when a fetus has rights is all about privileging the possibility of a future life over the actual life of a living, breathing adult. The problem with the whole debate about when life begins is that we have that debate inside women's bodies without their consent. I imagine a tiny boardroom table inside a woman's uterus. This is the kind of boardroom table, oak or mahogany, huge, that would be in the halls of power. But it's been shrunk down to microscopic size and placed inside the woman's uterus. And the table is right up next to the woman's uterine wall, where a blastocyte has recently implanted. It's about 6 to 7 days after the woman's egg was fertilized by a sperm cell to form the zygote. And in that time, the cells have been dividing rapidly from that one zygote cell to now a few hundred. The blastocyte consists of an inner cell mass, also called the embryoblast, which will become the embryo. And it also consists of an outer layer of cells called the trophoblast, which includes amnion cells, which will fill with amniotic fluid and become the amniotic sac. And the trophoblast will also merge with the woman's endometrium cells along her uterine wall and become the placenta. All that comes from that fertilized egg. Our tiny boardroom table is set up next to the implanted blastocyte, so everybody around the table can get a good look at it, and they can watch it develop and decide what they're going to do about it. Around that boardroom table inside the woman's body are lots of powerful people, mostly men. There's some doctors, some scientists, some clergymen, about 20 or 30 politicians. The woman is not at the table. She's the meeting room. There is a representative of a women's reproductive rights group there, but she's there under protest. She objected to the whole meeting, but her motion to move the meeting to a man's body did not receive a second. But of course she is right. The very fact that this debate is happening inside the woman's body has already violated this woman's autonomy. She has not consented to this meeting happening in her body. And as long as we continue to hold this meeting inside the woman, we've already compromised her autonomy as a person, as a human being. So at that point, we're not even really debating the sanctity of her autonomy, but simply when it ends. When she ceases to be a person with control over her body. When she becomes an object under the control of the state. I wish this could be an issue where we say there's some kind of middle ground. I just don't think there is. Many good people do. Many good people believe there's middle ground. The majority of Americans favor some restrictions on when an abortion can happen. Most people believe that a woman should have a right to an abortion at some point early in the pregnancy, but that the woman's right should be restricted more and more as the fetus develops. The problem is that decision about where the middle ground is will always be happening at that boardroom table inside the woman's body, made by people who are not her. Simply having the debate about what parts of the woman's body belong to her and what in her body is under her control have already taken away some of her personhood. I wish we could bless the middle ground here, but there's no middle ground when it comes to an adult's control over their body. It doesn't matter if that fetus could survive outside the body for 4 months gestation or at 5 months gestation. How would you get it out without her consent? Until that fetus is outside the woman's body and takes its first breath, it is part of her body and under her complete control. As Christians, we go to the Bible to guide us in ethical questions. But this is one of those modern ethical questions for which, many modern ethical questions for which the Bible doesn't give us easy answers. In fact, there's probably no modern ethical debate where we can look to the Bible and say, therefore the Bible says it, therefore it must be the law of the land. For one thing, one of the problems that we have as we try to discern what the Bible says and how it applies for today, one of the problems we have is that the Bible was written by a deeply patriarchal culture. And the injustice of that patriarchy is woven into the text. We don't need to look any further than the 10 Commandments to see this. Now, that's not to say the 10 Commandments are wrong at all, but they're written from the perspective of male supremacy over women. The 10th commandment is a perfect example. This basic spiritual ethical principle against coveting other people's stuff. Nothing wrong with that principle. But the list of stuff that's written in the Bible includes the man's donkey, ox, house, slave, and wife. All things that belong to him. All of these things are listed as the property of the man. And so we have gender inequality and gender injustice deeply interwoven into this basic spiritual principle. If we're looking for a specific reference to abortion in the Bible, you might be surprised that there is one, or it certainly seems to be something that approximates an abortion. It's in Numbers chapter 5, verse 11 through 31. And it's a bizarre text, and you have to sort of read the metaphor to hear what's happening. It talks about the woman's womb falling out of her. But what it describes is a commandment involving what happens when a husband suspects his wife, has had an affair. It describes the woman being brought forth to a priest, and she's made to drink water mixed with dust from the tabernacle floor. This is very basically an ancient trial by ordeal, is what sociologists call it. And if she was pregnant as a result of the suspected adultery, it was believed the water mixed with the holy dust of the temple would induce a painful abortion. It would also therefore prove her guilt. What do we do with a text like that? It certainly seems to put a value upon controlling the woman's sexual behavior, but absolutely no value upon the life of the fetus. Perhaps that is relevant today. Perhaps that's what we're doing most of all, is trying to control the women's behavior. But both of these texts, the Ten Commandments and Numbers, demonstrate that any biblical text, we have to study it with an unflinching awareness of the prejudice and biases of the author. That doesn't mean the texts are useless by any means. It just means they're limited in that way. And as we face these ethical questions today that biblical writers could not have imagined, we have to acknowledge that limitation. And still, even so, we can find in the Bible universal values and universal principles that transcend the biases and the prejudice. And this is a great place to plug Tuesday evening's Zoom presentation on reading the Bible from a queer perspective at 7 p.m. Another biblical concept we might lift up as we're searching the Bible for clues is the idea in the ancient Hebrew belief system that life begins with our first breath. The ancient Hebrews had no concept of eggs or sperm or blastocytes or fetal development, but what they did believe is that life was defined by breath. That's what made someone alive. The Hebrew word for soul is nephesh, and it means to breathe. So in the Garden of Eden, God brought Adam and Eve to life by breathing into them. In Job 37:3, Job says, "As long as breath is in me and God's breath is in my nostrils." In Job 33:4, it says, "The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life." In Psalm 104:29, it says, "God, when you hide your face from me, they are terrified. When you take away their breath, they die and return to dust." We're looking for a biblical definition of when life begins, and maybe that life begins when baby takes its first breath outside the womb. Until then, in the ancient worldview, it wasn't alive. Now you can see how those particular understandings would support a pro-choice side of the debate, and as tempting as that may be, to proof text that, to say, we have it, this is it, we're right. We can't do that with biblical texts. We can't use them as our final authority. That's not how we use the Bible. For instance, we would not want to use this definition of life to decide whether to do CPR on someone who has recently stopped breathing. Psalm 139 is often quoted by people who are anti-abortion. Psalm 139:13, the famous text, "You knit me together in my mother's womb." David is speaking to God, praying to God, saying, "God, you knit me together in my mother's womb." But again, this is one of those texts that you take the text and you take the interpretation. We know that if you're knitting a sweater, it's no good when it's half done. And if you're knitting a sweater, it really can't be used until it's cast off from the knitter's needles. Now you can use this text both ways. We're always taking the text and we're always taking the interpretation, and we're discussing it among our community, and we're taking in other values that we find in society, and we're trying to bring them all together. Now, if we're looking for biblical support for women's autonomy or feminist voices in the Bible, we can go right to Jesus, which as Christians, of course, is where we primarily go. And we could go to him and look to his encounters with women. We could see the woman at the well who goes toe-to-toe with Jesus in theological debate and becomes a very early evangelist. We can look to Jesus' response to the woman caught in adultery in John 8 as an example of Jesus turning the tables on male hypocrisy about sexual chastity. We could look to the parable of the woman searching for the lost coin as the way God looks for us, or the parable of the persistent widow demanding and receiving justice from the unjust judge. We could look to the women who are first at the tomb, first to see Jesus, first to see him raised from the dead, first to proclaim his resurrection to others. But perhaps the most helpful biblical passage, the one I want to lift up most today, is one that we turn to, again, for inspiration about women's autonomy. And it's what we read this morning, Proverbs 8. Again, it's not a smoking gun here, but there's a beautiful inspiration here about what it means for a woman to have power and autonomy, what it means to trust a woman's discernment. In the chapter, we find holy divine wisdom personified as a goddess, personified as a woman. Wisdom as that which calls us always to go deeper than our science, deeper than genetics, deeper than theology, deeper than any proof text in the Bible. Wisdom which combines knowledge on a body level with knowledge on a head level, with life experience, with joy and mercy, and the ability to see a bigger picture. So listen again to this description of the divine feminine wisdom. Doesn't wisdom cry out and understanding shout? Atop the heights and along the paths, at the crossroads, she takes her stand. By the gate before the city, at the entrance, she shouts. She says, my fruit is better than gold, even fine gold. My crops are better than choice silver. I walk on the way of righteousness and on the paths of justice. The Lord created me, the divine goddess wisdom, at the very beginning, before any deeds done in the past. I was formed in ancient times at the beginning, before the earth was, when there were no watery depths I was brought forth, when there were no springs flowing with water. I was there when God established the heavens and marked out the horizon on the deep sea, when the clouds were thickened and the foundations of the deep secured, when God set a limit on the sea so that the water would not go beyond them, when God marked out the earth's foundation. I was beside the Creator as a master of crafts. I was having fun. I was smiling the whole time. I was frolicking with all the creatures of the earth and delighting in the human race. So children, listen to me. Happy are those who keep to my ways. Listen to instruction and be wise. Don't avoid it. Happy are those who listen to me and watch daily at my doors, waiting at my doorposts. Those who find me find life, and they gain favor from the Lord. We cannot go to the Bible for final settlement of these modern ethical questions, for final settlement. We can go there for inspiration and guidance. We can go there for wisdom. And we can see that that wisdom that we seek from the Bible, the ancient people, when they tried to personify it, they said, it's most like a woman. The Bible's best attempt to imagine wisdom is to imagine it as a woman co-creating with God. And we can hear her voice if we listen, challenging our attempts to legislate the sacred, holy choices that women make about their bodies throughout their pregnancy. We can hear holy wisdom calling us to protect men, protect the equality of women, to have the same autonomy over their bodies that men have always demanded over theirs. If we are arguing about what point in her womb a fetus becomes a person, we've already made that woman into an object to be controlled by others. We've already taken away her autonomy. One of the hardest things about taking this approach for me is that I don't see this middle ground. There's no compromise, and as a card-carrying liberal progressive, that feels really weird. There's always the gray areas, right? Well, we always see the gray areas of every debate, yada, yada, yada. But there's no compromise here. If we believe in the autonomy of a woman over her body, an autonomy equal to a man's autonomy over his body, we shouldn't even be having this debate. Instead, we need to follow the example of Jesus as he turned over the tables in the temple and drove out the money changers. And so we need to turn over the boardroom table inside a woman's uterus and drive the politicians out of that holy temple of her body. I want to come to a close with a quote by Ursula Le Guin, who is one of the wisest authors I know. Mostly she writes fiction, but this quote from her is when she's speaking to a reproductive rights group. She said, "They asked me to tell you what it was like to be 20 and pregnant in 1950. When you tell your boyfriend you're pregnant, and he tells you about his friend in the army who got a girl pregnant, and so he got all his buddies to come and say, oh yeah, we all had sex with her, who knows who the father is? And your boyfriend laughs like it's a big joke. What was it like if you were planning to go to graduate school and get a degree and earn a living so you could support yourself and do the work you loved, What was it like to be a senior at Radcliffe and pregnant? And if you bore this child which the law demanded you bear and would then call unlawful and illegitimate, this child whose father denied it, what was it like? It's like this. If I had dropped out of college, thrown away my education, depended on my parents, if I had done all that, which is what the anti-abortion people want me to have done, I would have borne a child for them, for the authorities, for the theorists, for the fundamentalists. I would have borne a child for them, their child. But I would not have borne my own first child or second child or third child, my children. The life of that fetus would have aborted 3 other fetuses, the 3 wanted children, the 3 children I had with my husband, whom if I had not aborted the unwanted one, I never would have met. I would have been an unwed mother of a 3-year-old in California without work, with half an education, living off her parents. But it's those children I have to come back to. My children, Elizabeth, Caroline, Theodore, my joy, my pride, my loves. If I had not broken the law and aborted that life nobody wanted, they would have been aborted by a cruel, bigoted, and senseless law. They would never have been born. And this thought I cannot bear. What was it like in the Dark Ages when abortion was a crime? For the girls whose dad couldn't borrow cash as my dad could? What was it like for the girl who couldn't even tell her dad because he would go crazy with shame and rage? Who couldn't tell her mother, who had to go alone to that filthy room and put herself, body and soul, into the hands of a professional criminal, because that's what every doctor who did an abortion was, whether he was an extortionist or an idealist. You know what it was like for her. You know, and I know. And that's why we're here. We're not going back to the Dark Ages. We're not going to let anybody in this country have that kind of power over any girl or woman. There are great powers outside the government and in trying to legislate this return to darkness. We are not great powers, but we are the light, and nobody can put us out. Friends, we cannot have a debate about when life begins inside a woman's body without turning that woman into an object, without taking away her personhood. We must stand first and always for a woman's full autonomy over her own body. In this modern world where women still fight for basic equality with men and still fight injustice every day, we cannot take the side of a potential life over a real life, an actual life. We cannot take the side of something that is breathing over someone who is. The side of someone who is not breathing over someone who is. And now I will close with this quote from a Chinese philosopher named Lin Yutang. And this is a quote about hope, which I think we are sorely in need of right now. But he says that hope is not something that you just envision, that you just dream about. What he said is, hope is like a road in the country. There was never a road, but when many people walk on it, the road comes into existence. We have had the benefit of a road for many years, a road that was tread by the sacrifices and the work of our grandmothers and our great-grandmothers and our great-great-grandmothers. We have had a road that has been easier because of them. And we know that people have been trying to disrupt the road for a long time, and we know that this week, a small group of powerful people took a bulldozer to it and destroyed it. And our hope is not to envision that it just comes back, but to start treading the path anew, to start treading the path with our voices, with our conversations with relatives, to start treading that path with our votes and with our actions and the way we act in the world through equality toward women, to start treading that path every day in everything we do, in the way we organize and in the way we act. When we tread that road again, what we're doing, it's not going to be easy to tread a new road over one that's been bulldozed. But we will, as we do that, as we live into that hope, make that road easier for our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren. And that is the path that we have been given. That is the duty that we have been given as of this week. Doesn't wisdom cry out and understanding shout? Atop the heights, along the paths, at the crossroad, she takes her stand. Amen.